If you are a quarter as happy to be in this room right now as I am, we are in great shape. I am really just so delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank first Dr. Kleinhans for this invitation. As soon as she contacted me, I immediately accepted because I knew it would give me a chance to see my wonderful Trinity friends, and it just makes my heart burst with joy to see you here and now, friends that I've known and some new friends that I look forward to meeting and getting to know in our time together. I'd also like to thank AJ, who's been super helpful on many aspects in lining this up. And I'd really also like to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your busy lives to be here. I am really honored by that, and I look forward to learning with you during our time together. I'm going to share a lot of information with you, so I just would like to tell you now, if you would like a copy of any of the PowerPoints that I'm going to use today, twice, or tomorrow, I'd be very happy to send it to you. So just go to my website, juliefaithparker.com, very on brand. And there's a contact button. You can click on that, send me an email. I will hit reply and send you whatever would be helpful to you. So let us get started looking at children in the Bible. This is the title of our theme for these 2 days, Hidden in Plain Sight, the surprising power of the Bible's children. And so we're going to start talking about childist biblical interpretation. So just a show of hands, please. How many people in this room have ever heard of childist, like feminist or womanist, childist biblical interpretation? Okay, love it, love it. These are my former students, everyone. Okay. For those of you to whom this is new, you're not alone. For a lot of people, this is still very new. And childist biblical interpretation is analogous to feminist biblical interpretation, which we say is its mother hermeneutic. And we look at the children of the Bible with an eye to reassess their roles and importance, much as feminist scholars have done with the women of the Bible. And here's a definition of childist biblical interpretation, which I'll read for you. Childist biblical interpretation focuses on the agency and action of children and youth in the biblical text instead of seeing them primarily as passive, victimized, or marginalized. And this appears in the Oxford Handbook of Biblical Narrative. So the field has really taken off. It just was established initially in 2008. I'll say more about that in a moment. But when it first was established, scholars really needed to convince other scholars and people in general as to why this mattered. So I'd just like to review with you why it's so important to study the Bible's children. First, children and youth comprised about 1/3 of ancient populations. People in the biblical world did not live to be that old. Really, the average lifespan was around 40 or so. And even today, where you have populations where people don't live to be that old, a lot of the population is young. So in the biblical world, demographically, children were 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. And when scholars seek to study the biblical world and they leave out children, they're missing a huge percentage, perhaps as much as half, of the culture that they seek to understand. Studying the children also offers a new angle for exploring sociological issues. Take, for example, economics. Children in the biblical world worked. They did the jobs they could as soon as they became able to do them. And so they contributed to the economy. At the same time, they made demands of the economy because parents needed to use their own labor to keep the children alive. They needed to give the precious resource of food to the children. So they are integrally involved in economics. Another example would be adoption. Adoption in the ancient world, in Roman society, people adopted adults very routinely if you didn't have an heir. Adoption is really much more from the adult's interest, not so much from the child's perspective, looking out to take care of a child. So you just look at these issues from a child's perspective, and you get all kinds of new insights. Studying the children adds depth to our understanding of famous biblical characters who first appear as children. Let's take Moses, for example. So you may recall the story of Moses in the bulrushes, Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. We'll talk more about that shortly. And in this story, Moses, as you recall, he's put into this basket by his mother to save his life, and then he's raised by Pharaoh's daughter. This is critical for Moses' role later in the Bible because he's bicultural. So he identifies with the Hebrews, he wants to set them free, but he can speak Egyptian. That's how he talks to Pharaoh. So his role as a child is critical to understanding his story in the Bible. Child characters appear throughout the Bible. Raise your hand if you were in Children in the Biblical World with me. Children in the Bible, the class I taught Children in the Bible. Oh, good. Corey, Dawn. Alex, thank you very much. One of the exercises that we did was I would have the students choose any chapter of the Bible that they wanted, and then look for all the children in that chapter. You would be amazed how many children you would find, because children were part of families, clans, tribes, nations. It was an age-integrated society. We live in an age-segregated society. Look around, nary a child in sight, right? But in the biblical world, children were a part of everything all the time. And so they appear throughout the Bible, even in the background, often in the background. Also, studying the children points to a shared experience that the reader has with the character. I don't know much about your life, most of you, and you don't know much about mine, but we all have the common experience of having been a child. We all know that vulnerability, and that is a very formative part of our identity. Not only do we share this with each other, but we also share it with characters in the Bible. It gives us a way to relate to biblical characters. Children also have an important theological role in each testament. In the Hebrew Bible, this is how the covenant is passed down, through children. Jews do not proselytize. It is only through children that the covenant goes on. So they are critical, as we see repeatedly in the text. And in the New Testament, whom does Jesus take and put in the middle of the disciples and say, if you want to enter the kingdom, it needs to be like one of these? A child. So children are central theologically to both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And finally, I could go on, but I'm stopping with 7 because it's a biblical number. Okay. Studying the Bible's children affirms the role that living children have in communities of faith. And that's part of what we're here to talk about this year during Trinity Days. How does this make a difference in terms of empowering children in our congregations, letting them see that they are part of the Bible's story, that they are integral to all of the working of faith that takes place in these pages? So this field started in 2008. This is the year that this book, The Child in the Bible, was published, edited by Marcia Bunge. And it's also the year in which the Children in the Biblical World section of the Society of Biblical Literature was established. So the Society of Biblical Literature, most of you know, but some of you may not, that's the guild of Bible scholars, and they have different sections, or basically paper topic, meeting topics. And so this was established, Children in the Biblical World was established in 2008. And so it gives scholars a chance to come together and share thoughts and ideas and papers. And as a result, a lot of books have been published. All of these books have been published since 2013, really. The one in 2008 and then 2013. The rest have been published, and there are a lot more. I just filled up the slide with these. But it's really, the field is growing. It's now, let's say, 15 years old from 2008 to 23. And like a 15-year-old, it has come of age. It is healthy. It is thriving with a lot of potential. Childist biblical interpretation is also a postmodern approach. By this, I mean no one perspective is privileged. We look at portrayals of children in the text, not only as we find them in the text, but also we ask whose interests are served in this portrayal and to what end. So, as part of Capital's focus on children and nurturing children through worship and prayer, I'm going to share some childist exegesis with you. Later today, we'll apply this childist exegesis or hermeneutic more broadly, looking at prophetic children in both the Old and New Testaments. And tomorrow, we're going to apply what we've learned, engaging the material to see how it might be helpful for your context of ministry, your church, your cultures, and children perhaps in your own lives. But first, we're going to return our attention to the first child in the ancestor stories, and that is the often overlooked Ishmael. So let us first give ourselves a little bit of context for understanding Ishmael's story, a little literary context. Of course, we are in the book of Genesis. Genesis comes from this Greek word, genesis, meaning origin. And in the book of Genesis, we get stories of origins. In chapters 1 through 11, not in the text, these are designations that scholars have added to the text. We have, as many of you recall from your seminary training, the primeval history. These are myths, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, Tower of Babel, that deal with our primordial ancestors. And then in chapters 12 through 50, we have the stories of the ancestors. So in the primeval history, we get the stories of the origins of the world, then the origins of Israel. And this story, of course, starts with one person, and that person is? There we go, Abraham. Thank you so much. So the story begins in chapter 12, where Abraham is told by God to go, in Hebrew, lech lecha, go yourself and get to this land that I will show you. And so what does Abraham do? He goes. That's a huge leap of faith, not to be overlooked, because he leaves very sophisticated Ur in Mesopotamia, and he goes just to the land God will show him, he knows not where. He goes to this land of Canaan. But there is a problem when he gets there. What's the problem? He's going to have this great legacy, but what's the problem? I'm hearing. What's the problem? Can I have maybe a hand? No children. Thank you. What's your name? Thank you, Ralph. Exactly. No children. Let's read this. Can someone read this slide? Is that a little hard to read? Is it a little too tough to read? Yeah. Okay, then I'm going to read it for you. Okay, we're going to read the text of Ishmael's story because this is really important because we're going to keep coming back to it. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time reading. If anyone wants to come up and take a look, I'd be grateful, but if not, I'll take slide 1, okay? And then if someone wants to come up and read slide 2, then okay. So now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Your slave girl's in your power. do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. Okay, let me just highlight a couple of things in this passage we just heard. So the problem, as Ralph mentioned, is that Sarai is barren. And so she does something that we think is pretty modern. She takes a surrogate, right? But that's ancient. We read about that actually in Mesopotamia. Also, she takes a surrogate. She takes this slave, Hagar. Hagar means the stranger or the foreigner. So Sarai is the chief. Abram is the exalted father. So we've got this power dynamic in the text. And so she conceives. Now, you would think Sarai would be so happy Hagar conceives, because that's the plan, right? You're going to have a kid for me. But she's not. It's really upsetting to her. We've got this great contrast between Sarai and Hagar. Old, young, barren, fertile, rich, poor, princess, the outsider. And so she's not happy. When it says here in English, she looked with contempt on her mistress, that's not a good translation of the Hebrew. What the Hebrew says is she was light in her eyes. So Sarai was light in Hagar's eyes. She doesn't have to worry about her that much because she has this power of conception. But still, Sarai is very upset. Abram, the exalted father, just like, oh, do whatever, I don't care, you know. Since that's what happens. And let's see what happens next. This is really teeny, but Alex, can I call on you? Alex is such a player. I know she'd come up. She's so wonderful. Alex, big hand for Alex, everyone. She was my student, got the Bible Award at Trinity, got the Bible Award. If you would please read this. Can you hear her? No? Yes? Can you hear? Okay. Okay, you want to hear? Thank you.
And he said, Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am running away from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. Rude. And he shall live at odds with all of his kin. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, you are Elroy? For she said, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? Therefore the well was called, that word, it lies between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore Ishmael.
Beautiful job. Thank you so much, Alex. Ber lacharoi is I've seen God and remained alive after seeing him. You're supposed to die after seeing God. So notice how the angel comes to Hagar and tells her she is going to have a child. What do we call that when an angel comes to you and tells you you're going to have a child? That's right. First one in the Bible, not just Mary, friends, not just Mary. Here it comes to an African slave girl, right? She's from Egypt. This is Africa. First person in the Bible to receive an annunciation. Let's continue. Can I have a volunteer to read this passage, maybe? Oh, thanks, Larry, please. Come on up, would you? Larry, one of my students, Pastor.
But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman will not inherit along with my son Isaac. The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is also your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took a bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and he sent her away. And she departed and wandered around in the wilderness of Beersheba.
Thank you so much. So here we see that Sarah is upset. She has her own child, Isaac, and she makes sure that Hagar is sent away. Abraham is distressed, not distressed enough to stop it. God says, send them away, don't worry. And so off she is sent into the wilderness. The wilderness is the desert. You know how you say wilderness in Arabic? Sahara. Okay, so this is where she is sent. Fortunately, she has this skin of water. I will read the last one, a little bit of a reading inclusio. Here we go, where Ishmael is exposed and close to death. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, do not let me look on the death of the child. And she sat opposite him. She lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So here again we see Hagar running away out of water. She puts this child down under a bush. An angel comes to her again. She hears the voice of the boy. She gets this water and the promise that a great nation will be made of him. So my thesis that I want to share with you in the remainder of our time in this session is that Ishmael establishes a powerful precedent for both Moses and Jesus as children. All three of them, as you know, are foundational for the Abrahamic faiths: is Ishmael for Islam, Moses for Judaism, and Jesus for Christianity. All three of these leaders are introduced to readers as children. All survive economic, political, and physical dangers as outcast children. And perhaps their ability to persevere and the resulting resilience from their trials when they are young is what helps to prepare them for their eventual roles as renowned leaders. So these stories of children that we read in the text, we call the infancy narratives. And let's just look at the infancy narratives of Moses and Jesus as points of comparison. Amazingly, I was able to get actual photos. I know, it's really impressive. Okay, so Moses' infancy narrative, which we read about Exodus chapter 1:15 to 2:10. Just to recall, he's born to enslaved Hebrews, and Pharaoh is worried that the Hebrews are going to overrun Egypt, and so he orders all the male babies to be thrown into the Nile. Moses' mother puts her baby boy in a basket on the Nile's edge. His sister Miriam looks out for, she's not named in this text, but we know later Moses' sister is Miriam. She looks out for him. Pharaoh's daughter finds him in this basket. She brings him to her home. Miriam arranges for Moses' own mother to nurse him, and once he is weaned, Moses is returned to Pharaoh's daughter, and he grows up biculturally. Jesus' infancy narratives we read about in Matthew and Luke. In Luke chapter 1, verses 26 to 38, the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and announces the birth of a child, tells her she has found favor with God, and she agrees to bear this child. And then we read the birth of the Messiah in Matthew 1, 18 to 23. She's found to be with child. An angel appears to her in a dream. An angel appears to Joseph in a dream as a fulfillment of prophecy. And then the illustration you see here, Matthew 2, 13 to 18. We have the escape to Egypt. Herod is worried about the child as a threat. Joseph takes Mary and young Jesus to Egypt. Herod is furious. He kills baby boys, but Jesus is saved in Egypt and returns to Palestine after Herod dies. Now, the similarities between the infancy narratives of Moses and Jesus are well noted by scholars. especially in Matthew's gospel, especially Jesus' story as we read it in Matthew's gospel. So let's just go through them. Both Moses and Jesus are introduced to the reader as endangered children. Both are born to politically disenfranchised families. Moses is a slave and Jesus is in Roman-occupied Palestine. And they are subject to dominant powers. Both lands are governed by a fearsome tyrant, Pharaoh or Herod, and this despot seeks to kill the baby boys by throwing into the Nile or slaughtering them because they are a threat to the leader's power. The little peers of the babies meet violent ends, either being thrown into the Nile by Pharaoh's orders or being slaughtered by Herod's soldiers. The boy child, who is the focus of the story, escapes through the help of family members. Moses' mother and sister look out for him, and Jesus has Joseph and Mary who take him to Egypt, fleeing from Herod's territory. Each boy finds safety in Egypt, right, in Pharaoh's daughter's household, or going to Egypt, and both of them grow into leaders who look out for the vulnerable, the slaves and those who are disenfranchised. Their faith traditions continue this legacy of looking out for those who are vulnerable, experiences that both of them had as young children. Scholars suggest that these similarities between Moses and Jesus in their stories as children are intentional, especially in Matthew's gospel, because the writer is geared towards a Jewish audience, and the writer wants to make the hard sell that Jesus is the Messiah to deliver his people as Moses was, and so draws on aspects of Moses' story to make Jesus sound familiar, and marking Jesus as the new Messiah in these scriptures. So while these parallels between Moses and Jesus are well known, and you can read about this in commentaries, I suggest that the connections that Ishmael has with Moses and Jesus surpass those that Moses and Jesus have with each other. So let's take a look at some of these similarities. Okay. Ishmael, Moses, and Jesus are vulnerable children. They are all disenfranchised. Ishmael is born to this slave girl, Hagar. Moses is also born to enslaved peoples, the Hebrews. And Jesus is born to Jewish parents in Roman-occupied territory. They're all disenfranchised by their low position in society. They're vulnerable, there's this lack of rootedness in their culture, and all three of them are marginalized as they hover close to the brink of death. They have this imperiled existence. Ishmael, Moses, and Jesus also arguably have young mothers. Now, the text does not explicitly say that they are young, but Hagar contrasts Sarah in many ways, including age, it seems. And Mary, we know, is just betrothed to Joseph, and young girls were eligible to be betrothed as soon as they got their periods, because people didn't live to be that long. So once you started menstruating, you were fair game to marry, and that's early teenage years. And so so she's not yet married, so she is probably a teenager. And you know this, right, from your studies. You know Mary's probably likely a teenager. What about Moses' mother? Anyone know her name? Oh, yes? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Very impressive. My student also, just saying. Okay. Jochebed, she's not named here, but she is named in Exodus 6:20 and also Numbers 26:59. So we see also the fertility of these three women. They all conceive very quickly, in contrast to many other biblical women. The word, if you look at Exodus chapter 2, verse 1, you will read in Hebrew that a Levite man took in English you see woman, no. In Hebrew it says bat, or daughter, from the tribe of Levi. And bat is the most common word signifying a girl in the Hebrew Bible. The word for girl in Hebrew, yalda, only appears 3 times. That's it. But we know that girls were integral to the culture. But when you read about a daughter, because she's in her father's household, like Jephthah's daughter, chances are she's teenage years or younger, so keep that in mind. Moses' mother, Jochebed, is introduced to us as a bat, or as a girl. She becomes an Isha, a woman, once she's married in the text, but first she's introduced as a girl. So they all conceive rather easily, underscoring the probability that they're young. And think about this in contrast to other mothers in the Bible, some of whom we're explicitly told are old. Sarah is one example. Also, Rebecca has a hard time conceiving, so does Rachel, Samson's mother, Hannah, and Elizabeth. So their stories frequently suggest the passage of time before conception, but in these stories, the young women, I suggest, conceive right away, partially because they are young. Hagar and Mary also receive annunciations. There are other annunciations in the Bible. If you Google this, which I did not long ago, in Wikipedia, you'll see annunciation, it goes right to Mary. You know better, okay? First of all, we have Hagar. That's the first annunciation in the Bible. Also, Sarah, an angel comes to her, tells her she's going to have this child, Genesis 18. Isaac and Rebecca have an annunciation. Rachel has an annunciation. Samson's mother, she doesn't have a name, wife of Manoah, or Samson's mother. And Hannah, all of them have these special emissaries that come to them and tell them that they will have a child. But the first annunciation in the entire Bible is to Hagar, the African slave girl. This is where the pattern is established. Here's the pattern of an annunciation. Think of Mary's story when I tell you what happened with Hagar, okay? This divine emissary appears, tells them they will have a son. The teenage girl speaks with the angel. The angel offers a promise. The mothers react with amazement. The visit is divinely initiated, and the promise of exceptional progeny is fulfilled. That's the classic annunciation pattern, and we have every step with Hagar. We have every step with Mary. But let's take a look at these annunciations. Okay. I'm going to read this for you. This is what the angel Gabriel says to Mary. The angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great. He will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his ancestor David. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." How would you describe the feeling of that annunciation? I'm seriously asking. What are some adjectives you would use? Rejoicing? Rejoicing. Thank you, Jeff. Rejoicing. Good. What else? Excitement. Doubtful? Doubtful? Did you say doubtful, Stu? Yeah. Why? Okay, maybe it's too much. It's so much. But it's, I'm sorry, Ellie? Hyperbole. Okay, but it's very positive, right? I mean, all these wonderful things are going to happen to your son. I mean, it'd be encouraging if you were a vulnerable young mother. You'd hear this like, well, this bodes well. I mean, at least it bodes well. But listen, let's hear what Alex read for us before. I'm going to read it again. This is the promise to Hagar. Listen to this contrast. "And the angel of the Lord said to her, 'Now you've conceived, you shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction.'" So far, so good, right? But get this, verse 12. "He will be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall live at odds with all his kin." Okay, let's just unpack this a little bit, because I suggest to you, my friends, that there is a lot going on with the translation here. Let's take a closer look. So here you see the Hebrew, and then so what I read for you was the New Revised Standard Version. Some of you may be familiar with the NRSV UE, the updated edition. It just came out. The translation of that verse is the exact same as the NRSV. They didn't change anything. The American Standard Version, so that's the Catholic academic translation, is very similar. "He shall be a wild ass among men. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his brethren." Same kind of negative pronouncement, right? And the academic Jewish translation, the Tanakh, reads, "He shall be a wild ass of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell alongside of all his kinsmen. So that last phrase is a little more optimistic, but still we get this belligerent view of Ishmael. And commentators pick up on this a lot. Commentators, E.A. Spicer in the Anchor Bible Commentary talks about Ishmael as a savage man. Walter Brueggemann says he's out of the promised land, not living by the promise. Lee Humphreys says he's untamed and against his kin. Dolores Williams says this is more like a curse than a blessing. But we know that to translate is to interpret. And I suggest that this difficult image of Ishmael comes more from our translators' biases than it does from the Hebrew text. So let's unpack it together. I'm going to read this for you in Hebrew, and then I've color-coded all the different words, and I will grammatically explain to you why I've translated the way I have. Stick with me. It's kind of dense, but you're all really bright, and I know we can get through it, okay? Vehu yehi pere adam, Veyado bechol veyad kol bo ve'al panei kol achav yeshkon. Okay, so he will be, hu yehi, some of you I know have had Hebrew, so you just follow with me here. Hu yehi, he will be, that's straightforward. Pere Adam. The word pere, we see here as wild ass. Who wants to be called an ass? No one wants to be called an ass, right? I mean, that's almost a curse word in English. It's very derogatory. The typical word, there are two words that designate a donkey-like creature in Hebrew. The first is chamor, and that means a beast of burden. And that's most often what we see in the Hebrew Bible. But pere is a wild donkey that runs free. We read about this in Job. It's a wild donkey that runs along the plains. Now you're Hagar, and you're feeling like a chamor. You're feeling like a beast of burden, people treating you like an animal. You have a kid now because I want you to. But she's told, no, your child is going to be like you, only wild and free. A pere Adam. Now, these two words are closely linked in Hebrew, pere Adam, and that's called a construct chain. Some of you may remember this from your studies of Hebrew. That means two words are in close relationship to each other. Usually a genitival of relationship, but they're closely related. But the emphasis is on the absolute noun, the second noun. So it's really, he will be like a wild donkey of a person. So the emphasis is on Adam, or humanness, in this. He will be a free, wild donkey like you, but this person, not just a wild donkey, a wild, free person. Okay, with the yad bechol, and his hand, so the word yad means both hand and power. Hebrew is a very embodied language, and parts of our body take on metaphysical meanings. Like yad means hand and also power. Af means nose and also anger. Rechem means womb, and rechamayim means compassion. So here, when you see yad in Hebrew, you can translate it as either hand or power. So I choose power. So instead of his hand will be against everyone, his hand, yado, bakol, will be in everything. Ba, some of you are taking it means in. Kol means all. It can mean all things, all people, all everything. So instead of his hand will be against, so I looked up this exact pointing, the dots and dashes around the consonants, around the letters. And bakol, pointed like that, appears 554 times in the Bible. I went through every single one. Kidding, the computer did it, okay? But it appears exactly like bakol appears 500, it's common, right, in everything and all. The times it appears with this exact pointing is 4. In every other time, the translators translate ba as in, except with Ishmael, they translate it as against. What? So his hand will be in all things, and his power will be in all things, veyad kol bo, and the power of all things in him. Al panei kol achav yishkon, okay? And instead of al panei, against everyone, it can be in the presence of all. Ach means brothers, but more generally can mean kin. Of all his brothers, yishkon, he will dwell. So instead of this about being a wild ass and against everyone, you can legitimately translate it as I have here. He will be a person like a wild donkey. His power will be in everything, and the power of everything will be in him, and he will dwell in the presence of all his brothers. How would you feel receiving that? Okay, that's an enunciation. That's an enunciation that is in the pattern of all the other enunciations that we have in the Bible. All the other enunciations are positive, and I suggest to you that this one should be too. So hopefully you'll be getting a notice soon where your Bibles will be recalled and they can make the correction. But here's the question I want to ask you. Why do translators judge the son of the slave woman so negatively before he's even born? Right. So here we see this child and this promise that he is sent, he is here in the wilderness. But also he has to, we're going to go back to, now we've seen our enunciation, we're going to go back to our comparisons. Ishmael, Moses, and Jesus have to leave home in order to survive, right? They're going to die if they stay their enslaved family, or also with Sarah sends them away when the boys are being killed with Moses and Jesus. But both of them, their fathers received this divine guidance. Their fathers received the divine guidance. So I'm going to read this for you, what God said to Abraham. Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring. So here the father gets this reassurance, this child's going to be okay. And then in Matthew 2:13, now after they had left, they're going to Egypt, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, after the Magi had left, appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. So here Joseph is told that they need to go. So it's through this divine guidance that comes also to the fathers. We've seen the annunciations to the mothers, and now this divine guidance to the fathers, offering reassurance when the child is threatened. So they need to leave home to survive. Let's review this. They're both, Ishmael and Moses are both exposed outside. Hagar has no more water. She places Ishmael under a bush. She puts him in a shaded place to keep him alive and protected from the sun. Moses' mother also carefully places her son. The same word for son is used in both instances, yeled in Hebrew, ha-yeled. She puts him outside in a basket on the Nile. The basket is lined with the bitumen and pitch, and she protects him from the water, protected from the sun, protected from the water. And in both cases, a female family member hovers nearby to make sure that the child is okay. The same word, rakach, is used, distance of a bow shot, and Moses' sister watches from a distance. There, Ishmael and Moses, one is saved by water. Ishmael gets a drink. Moses is saved from water, from the drowning. And Egypt is the place where they find security. The child, with a child who is exposed, cries, is alone. The children weep. Moses weeps. God hears the voice of the child, and the child is saved while God is apparently motivated by these cries. They grow up to become great. The children, they go on to greatness. They become the leaders of 12 princes, tribes, or disciples. Now, you know that Moses is the leader of 12 tribes. And you know that Jesus, of course, is a leader of the 12 disciples. But what you might not know is that Ishmael also is the father of 12 princes. Nasim is the word in Hebrew. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will bless him and make him fruitful and exceedingly numerous. He shall be the father of 12 princes. I will make of him a great nation. Did you know that about Ishmael? Also the father of 12, just like Moses, just like Jesus. Egypt has offered this place of security, as I mentioned. Hagar gets Ishmael, a wife from Egypt. In Genesis 21:21, we read, He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Where does Moses grow up? Egypt, under the protection of Pharaoh's daughter. And Egypt, as we've seen, is also where Jesus finds safety when fleeing Pharaoh. To fulfill the words spoken by the prophet, Matthew 2:15, out of Egypt I have called my son. So all three of them go on to this greatness, and they have these incredible futures because of, not despite, but really because of what they've experienced as children. And they have these amazing stories that mark them for greatness from the beginning. So now I'm going to give you a chart that summarizes everything we've gone over, okay? So here we see they're born. I'm just going to read this for you. It might be a little hard from the back, but we've got chapter and verse. The boys are born into a vulnerable position. The mother of the babies enslaved, Ishmael, Moses. The mother to be conceives easily, all of them. A harsh ruler forces departure from home, all three. Angel comes to the mother to be, comes with Ishmael and Jesus. The angel engages in dialogue with the mother to be, Ishmael and Jesus. The angel offers assurance, Ishmael and Jesus. The angel gives the name of the child, Ishmael, Jesus. Angel foretells the child graceness, Ishmael, Jesus. Mothers to be express amazement or disbelief, Ishmael and Jesus. Narrator reports the birth of a child, Ishmael, Jesus. Child must leave home, hoping for survival, all three. Father receives divine intervention, Ishmael, Jesus. Mother exposes the child, Hayeled puts him in a place that could offer protection, Ishmael and Moses. A girl hovers Rekach from the exposed child a distance, Ishmael and Moses. The child cries, Ishmael and Moses, that's in the Septuagint. An angel intervenes to rescue the child with water and withdrawing him from the water, Ishmael, Moses. The child's future is secured with a place to grow up and become great, same word in Hebrew, Yigdal, Ishmael and Moses. Egypt offers security, future wife for Ishmael, Pharaoh's house for Moses, and the place of refuge for Jesus. So we see here that we have all of these similarities that with Ishmael and the others that far exceed the comparison that's well known between Jesus and Moses. Between Jesus and Moses, their infancy narratives, there are 5 points of connection. Like Moses, Ishmael has an exposure story. There are 6 points of connection. Like Jesus, Ishmael has an annunciation story with 8 points of connection. Like Moses and Jesus, Ishmael needs to leave his home to be safe. And in total, if you go through this chart, you'll see there are 19 points of shared connection that Ishmael has with both Moses and Jesus as children. And like Moses and Jesus once grown, Ishmael also leads a band of 12. Ishmael with 12 princes, Moses with 12 tribes, and Jesus, as we've said, with the 12 disciples. So we meet Ishmael in Genesis. He's the first of these 3 to appear canonically. And Moses, of course, in Exodus, Jesus is in the New Testament. Islam is the last of these Abrahamic traditions. Judaism is first, then Christianity, and then Islam. And so we have this biblical reversal established because Ishmael is the first in the canon, but here we have the last tradition comes from the first mentioned in the Bible. But Ishmael, Moses, and Jesus are in this order, but we see that the first child in the story gives way to the last of these traditions. Are you hearing echoes of Mark 10:31? Many who are last will be first, and the first will be last. Childish interpreters connect the stories of biblical children to living children to garner attention for shared situations and challenges. The story of Israel's firstborn son resonates not only with the tribulations and triumphs of young Moses and Jesus, but also relates to millions of refugee children around the world today. According to the United Nations, the crisis of child refugees has reached devastatingly high numbers not seen since World War II. The United Nations Committee on Refugees defines a refugee as someone who has fled war, violence, conflict, or persecution and has crossed an international border to find safety in another country. The story of Jesus fleeing the persecution of Herod involves the crossing of an international boundary. The stories of Moses and Ishmael do not, however, they involve persecution and leaving one's home to survive. Like the biblical boys discussed above, refugee children live precariously. They flee from one place to another and are exposed to the elements. While the stories of Ishmael, Moses, and Jesus might offer hope for refugee children and their families, these infancy narratives also call for human advocacy and for divine intervention in situations of severe struggle. As children forced to leave their homes in search of safety, modern refugee children, along with Moses and Jesus, have a powerful precedent in the Bible. Call them Ishmael. Thank you, my friends. You're having half as much fun as I am. We're in great shape. So I'm going to start now with a shameless commercial, forgive me, but this is for my book. It just came out on September 12th, called Eve Isn't Evil, Feminist Readings of the Bible to Upend Our Assumptions. This book is unlike anything else I've ever done before in that it is far more personal. In this, I intertwine academic knowledge about the Bible with some very personal stories from my own life. I also share stories that people have shared with me, some from relatives, some from friends, some from colleagues, and some from former students. So if you read the book, you might find yourself in there. But you'll be really camouflaged unless you gave me your permission, in which case your name's in the acknowledgments, and you're aware of that. So this book seeks to be accessible for anyone, including and beyond the scholarly community. And it mostly offers a feminist perspective on biblical texts. I've also designed the book to be useful for congregations. At the end of each chapter, there are discussion questions that are specifically designed for community building. So it's mostly a feminist perspective, and as Dr. Kleinhans mentioned, my first Amazon review was someone who said that to be feminist was to be anti-Christ. So if you consider going on Amazon and writing a review, that'd be really nice. But even in this book, I had to bring in children because this is really my academic passion. And so chapter 10, as you see here, it's called, it's kind of hard to read, but it's called Curious Like Eve, Learn More. And this is a series of academic excursions or detailed discussions that correspond to each of the previous chapters. And in one chapter, I talk about prophecy. That chapter is called Prophet from Prophecy. And at the end, in chapter 10, there's an excursus called Children Can Be Prophets Too. And so that gives rise to our title of this talk, The Holy Spirit Does Not Discriminate. Children Can Be Prophets Too. But let's give a little bit of a background first on prophecy. So now for our second session, we're going to talk about children who are prophets in the Bible, and I'm going to review the texts that I highlight within this excursus. We're going to look at some specific texts, but because these biblical stories of prophetic children are not very well known, I'm going to introduce them to you with brief film clips. They're all 2 minutes or less, 4 brief film clips. Sometimes I discovered to my horror, the advertisements come up. Just ignore those if they do, okay? But we're going to see how these prophetic children not only broaden our understanding of prophecy, but also how they enrich our understanding of life for children in the biblical world. But let's begin looking at prophets. So what is a prophet? The word prophet comes from the Greek prophetes, designating a spokesperson really, one who speaks forth, one who proclaims, one who speaks of the future, one who speaks before. So it's very much a public role to be a prophet. The Hebrew word for prophet is navi. This may sound familiar. What is it? In James Cameron in these Avatar movies, right? Aren't they navi, right? It means prophet. But the word nabu, the verb in Akkadian, also a Semitic language, cuneiform Semitic language, it means to call, to announce, to name, one who calls or one who is called. And that's what prophets do. Prophets are called by a deity, and they call people to that deity. Prophets also have lots of different roles. We tend to think in our culture at large rather simplistically about prophets, that they're people who predict the future or they tell us something that's going to happen. But it's actually much more complex and much more nuanced. So I'd like to talk with you briefly about the different roles that prophets perform, and this is based on sociological and anthropological studies. So these are all different, these are all different roles that prophets fulfill. One is they have a public cultic function as priests. Prophets can also be preachers who speak messages from God. A medium is someone who provides a bridge between people, the living, and the spiritual realm. A necromancer is someone who speaks to the dead. You may recall the story of the woman of Endor, 1 Samuel 28. She's a necromancer. A diviner is someone who has extra insight into the divine. A seer can predict the future and receives visions. A mystic is someone devoted to otherworldly practices. A shaman is someone who can tap into the power of another world and harness it. A shaman almost acts like a human funnel. It's like you take this spiritual energy and then you direct it where you want it to go, often for healing. And a wonder worker is someone who can perform miracles. Probably the best catch-all way to explain a prophet is as an intermediary between the divine and the human realms, or in the Hebrew Bible, between this God, Yahweh, and the people. There's also not hard and fast, oh, you're a diviner, so you can't be a preacher. You know, there's a lot of overlap here, and we see that in biblical portraits of different prophets as well. Generally, the latter prophets tend to dominate our thinking. These are the writing prophets. These are books in which we find collections of materials by and about the prophets. The major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Why are they the major prophets? There we go, my student. Jeff, go and tell us. Longer books, that's it, longer books. It doesn't have anything to do with the power of their messages, they have the longer books. So those are the major prophets. Our minor prophets are arranged in order from longest to shortest. You see Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And if you were my student, I made you memorize that. All the books of the Bible in order. The earlier prophets, like Moses and Elijah and Elisha. So we have these 15 prophetic books, but we read about prophets throughout the Hebrew Bible, right? Like we read about Elijah and Elisha and Moses we talked about. These are all prophets, even though they are not the writing prophets, the ones that have books named after them. And so the early prophets like Moses and Elijah and Elisha, they're kind of like superheroes, right? Like Moses parts the water, and Elijah calls for the flame to come down, and Elisha brings back a child from the dead. So they really are wonder-working prophets, or perhaps shamans. They're like superheroes, but the latter prophets, not so much. The latter prophets some of them are in contact with kings, like Isaiah. Some of them have bands of followers, like Elijah, Elisha. But also, so we've got the early prophets, we've got the writing prophets, but we also have women prophets. So there are 5 women in the Hebrew Bible who are explicitly called prophets. And I talk about some of these women in the chapter Prophet from Prophecy. But just to review who they are. So Miriam, we read in Exodus 15:20, then the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand. All the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing. So she is called a prophet. We don't know exactly what she does that's prophetic. It may be this leadership role that she has. And these are the other passages in which we read about her. Again, she doesn't get a whole lot of ink in the entire Bible. Also Exodus 2 as a child, although she's not named there. But she is a prophet. Also Deborah is a prophet. Deborah, she is a judge in the book of Judges. She's called a judge, and she's also called, at that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. Wife of Lapidoth is a terrible translation. It should be fiery woman. Isha means wife or woman. Lapidoth means torch, a woman of torches. Don't get me started on sexism and translations. We'd be here for a long time. But this is one example, and she is a prophet. Huldah is also a prophet. We read about her in the book of 2 Kings. She is the prophet to whom the king goes. Josiah goes to her when he seeks to have a scroll that he finds in the temple explained. And she interprets this scroll for him, called a prophet. Isaiah's wife, I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. The Lord said to me, name him Maher-shalal-hash-baz. This may be the first clergy couple in the Bible, who knows, the prophet and the prophetess. But here we see this woman is also described as a prophet. And then there's one final one, Noadiah. We read about her within the book of Nehemiah. We don't know anything about her except she is someone of whom Nehemiah is afraid. In Nehemiah 6:14, remember Tobiah and Shambat, oh my God, according to these things that they did, and also the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid. So somehow she's got power over the great Nehemiah. So we know that there are men who are prophets in the Bible. We see that there are women who are prophets in the Bible, but children can be prophets too. Because, as I've said, unlike people, the Holy Spirit does not discriminate. So we talked earlier today about the greatest prophet of the Hebrew Bible, best known, of course, is rhymes with Shmoses. Moses. He acts as an intermediary. He performs a number of these roles, right? He's a wonder worker, he's a preacher, he's a mystic, how he communes with God, and he is also introduced to us as a child, as we have discussed. Okay, easier question. Who's the greatest prophet of the New Testament? There we go, okay. Jesus also performs a number of these roles. He is a wonder worker. He does miracles of multiplying the loaves and fishes, right? He's a preacher. He acts as a shaman when he heals people, takes a spiritual power, directs it in a certain way. And we're also introduced to Jesus as a child. We talked earlier today about the story of Jesus and when he flees with Herod, the Annunciation with his mother. But also the first time Jesus speaks is in Luke chapter 2. He speaks as a child there in the temple. So these are children whom we know in the Bible. We just discussed them as children. You knew those stories. But there are also extraordinary children whom we don't know. And to be an extraordinary child, to be an extraordinary person in the Bible, you have an extraordinary story. And that's not only true for Moses, it's not only true for Jesus, it is also true for Samuel. So Samuel also has an Annunciation story. You'll recall in 1 Samuel 1 and 2, he is born to Hannah, who had been barren, and she prays to God in the temple at Shiloh. Eli the priest thinks that she is drunk, but she speaks up for herself. She defends herself. Her petition to have a child is granted. She offers a psalm of gratitude that is the basis for Mary's Magnificat, and the child Samuel is born. Samuel's destiny is she vows that if she has a child, she vows that she will give this child to the Lord. And so once he is weaned, Hannah brings Samuel to the temple at Shiloh. And he is just a child, and he is called by God. So I'm going to start this less than 2-minute film clip in a moment where Samuel's being called. And I want you to please, as you watch this, think how you would feel if this were happening to you. So sort of try to empathize with Samuel. But before I show it to you, I need to ask everyone here to repeat something after me. I'm going to say it. I want you to repeat it. There are no white people in the Bible. Not a one, okay? So any of you who can make Bible films, help me out here because we're stuck with this image of white people, but it will hopefully be helpful to us as we try to remember this story of Samuel.
The child Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli. Samuel did not yet know the Lord, neither was the word of the Lord yet revealed unto him. And it came to pass, when Eli was laid down in his place, the Lord called to Samuel. Samuel.
Here am I, thou callest me.
I call not. Lie down again.
Samuel. Twice more Samuel heard the voice and went up to Eli.
Here am I, for thou didst call me.
Samuel, go lie down. If he calls again, say, Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth.
Samuel. Samuel.
Speak, for thy servant heareth.
And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him. And all Israel knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord.
Oh yeah, there were my commercials. How would you feel if you were Samuel? Confused. Thank you, Chris. Kind of confused, absolutely. Keep getting this calling. Little scary, right? I mean, I thank you. It seems like it'd be a little scary. This voice is calling to you. You think it's the priest Eli. He's at this temple at Shiloh. But I'd be terrified, right? You hear this voice in the middle of the night again and again. Who is it? What's going on? But he says, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Well, the movie conveniently cuts off there because what happens is he gets, I'll just tell you about it. He gets this really tough call. The text goes on to say that Samuel needs to tell Eli that God is going to punish him and his house forever because Eli's sons were taking the best parts of the sacrifices for themselves. So Samuel's a child living at the shrine at Shiloh under the protection of Eli, and God goes on to tell him he needs to give this horrible prophecy to Eli about Eli's own sons. And so what Samuel says repeatedly, do you remember what he says in the movie? What's he say when he hears the voice, Samuel, Samuel? Here am I, right? Very calmly, here am I. In Hebrew, it's hineni. Literally, it's like, behold me. Hine is sort of this particle of immediacy. It's like, me, okay? It's just like, and this is the classic prophetic response. Like, here I am, I'm ready to do the work. And that's what Samuel says, this classic response. And then he is indeed ready because he goes on to deliver this prophecy. He goes on to tell Eli what's going to happen to his sons. The word used to describe Samuel in this text, the Hebrew word is na'ar, and it can indicate someone who is young, or it can indicate someone in a position of servitude, often both. We get the impression that Samuel here is young because he was brought just after he was weaned, and at the end of this episode, the text goes on to specify that he grew up. We see here a child being asked to do something extremely difficult. And this is important for us to keep in mind because it's not this, we have this very romantic idea of childhood. It's carefree, children are so innocent, youth is wasted on the young. Being a child is hard. There's a lot that you need to negotiate. It's really difficult. And we see that here in the Bible. The text not only shows children doing hard things, it shows them as capable of doing hard things. Here, Samuel takes on a classic prophetic role in that he speaks truth to power to the priest Eli at this shrine. He's marked from youth for greatness, and Samuel goes on to fulfill multiple prophetic roles. He's a priest, he's a prophet, and he paves way for the kingship. Like Jesus, Samuel has a dramatic birth story with an annunciation, and he's associated with a place of worship, Shiloh or Jerusalem. Let's look at another boy who comes to us as a prophetic child, and this is Jeremiah. Let me read the text for you. Now the word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you, I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, oh, Lord God, truly I do not know how to speak, for I'm only a boy. But the Lord said to me, do not say I'm only a boy. You shall go to all to whom I send you, and you shall speak whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. Then the Lord put his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, now I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. Here we see Jeremiah, who is being called. And this happens. It says, now see, it says in English, the word of the Lord came to me. That's from the Hebrew hayat. It actually is a better translation would be, the word of the Lord happened to me. Or it's like the word of the Lord happens to you. And we see him, Jeremiah is called by God. How old is he when he's called by God? How old is he when he's consecrated? 0. He's a fetus. Okay, when you were in the womb, I consecrated you. And this is really important. God does not see anyone as too young. Even before he's born, Jeremiah is called by God. And he's on a big mission from this young age to whom he's going to go. I appoint you, verse 10, I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms to pluck up and pull down, destroy and overthrow, build and to plant. It's not one day, it's right now. See, today, he's a child. Today I appoint you. And Jeremiah's response, oh, Lord God, I don't know how to speak. I'm only a boy. He gives a denial, and then he gives a reason. I'm just a kid. I'm not up to this. Does this sound familiar? Can you think of any other prophets who are called and then denied the call? Yeah, like lots of them, right? Okay, this follows the classic call pattern, which we see very clearly with Moses. I'm slow of speech and of tongue when Moses is called by God. So we see this also with Jeremiah. And we actually have in Jeremiah's call the classic call formula. We have a divine encounter in verse 4. We have identification of the deity. I'm the one who formed you in verse 5a. Verse 5b, it's the commission. You're appointed prophet to the nations. Verse 6, we have the objection. I don't know how to speak. I'm just a boy. Verses 7 to 8, we get this divine reassurance. And then in verse 10, we get the sign. You're going to be appointed to do these things. Jeremiah is also like Jesus. Let's take a look at that. Luke 42 through 47. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. Jeremiah, like Jesus, is known by God before he's even born. He has great prophetic work set before him as a child. He's introduced as a prophetic child who's going to speak widely, who's going to speak to nations, and he grows up speaking publicly as a child. And Jeremiah, despite his objections to God, is doing the same thing. Let's take a look at the Israelite slave girl, and hopefully we can get our movie to work here. Let's see if I can. Let's see, 1 minute. So sorry. Okay, this is, I'm gonna splurge on this. I'm gonna tell you about this story because it's just 4 minutes in. We're gonna give it now. Let's go back. Play. Okay. So I'm gonna tell you about this story while it's playing. I'll turn down the volume until we get to the point I want. Okay, we're gonna see. So we read about the story of the Israelite slave girl in 2 Kings chapter 5. And what happens in this story is these raiders go from Israel to Aram. And they get there and they capture a girl and they take her down to Israel. And there she becomes a slave. And this was not uncommon in the ancient world, that people would take children and they would just kidnap them and they would use them as slaves. So this slave girl, it was brought to another land to be used as a slave. And I want you to think about that, all that would mean for her. She's bereft of her family, she's bereft of her language, she is bereft of her people, and she is taken to these people whom she knows not at all, and she works as a slave. It is important, so here's the girl. So she in this movie depiction, we know nothing about her early life in the text, but in the movie depiction, she's about to be hurt, and then Naaman, this commander, rescues her. And so he's really portrayed as the good guy in the film. Okay. None of this is in the Bible, okay? He's really portrayed as the good guy in the film, and he takes this girl. And so he's really made to seem like the savior, right? He's the one who's rescuing her. He's taking her, she's about to be killed, and he's going to bring her to safety. That she happens to work for a slave for him. That you can lose that part in this movie story because she's really well dressed, and she looks really well cared for, and she seems like she's suddenly tamed, and there's this huge transformation. So we see him really as the hero, so it's very dramatic. She reaches for his hand, and it's also lovely, and he's going to take her away. Not that romantic in real life, okay? Whenever I'd show movies to my students, I would always emphasize, first of all, I have a question. Are there white people in the Bible? No, thank you. Okay, I would always emphasize not only that, but also how they have to add things in to give the story some time. So here she is, Naaman's slave girl. She's serving Naaman's wife. And so it's interesting, just like Hagar was Sarai's slave, this girl is the slave for Naaman's wife. And here she is in this home, and according to the movie, they've got this really lovely, caring relationship. But the problem is Naaman. So Naaman is afflicted with leprosy, and he is this commander who's who's a total contrast to the girl. And you see, all his ugly sores and how this really afflicts him. He's got everything going for him except that he has this leprosy. And his wife is very kind and very caring in this movie, but we don't get that much about her in the text. Oh, there's the doctor, I can't do anything. But he is this great commander from Aram, which is modern-day Syria, just north of Israel. And so they're all very distressed. And notice who comes to the rescue. Okay, I'm going to bring up the volume here because we're just about at our point. Oh, can I get my volume here? To the TV? Oh, there we go. Surprise, it's in Hebrew. Didn't happen before. Well, it doesn't really matter because in the Bible she says nothing, okay? But what she's doing is she's expressing this concern for him. So, he says, I am a leper. Oh, English, surprise. Okay. She says, you are a mighty man of valor, which is what the text does say, but she doesn't say it in the text. These are words she really speaks in the text, what the girl says now. 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 3.
Would call that my Lord. Would that my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy.
That verse is in the text. This girl is really kind of amazing. So I call her the Israelite slave girl. She doesn't have a name in the text. She is the only girl in the entire Hebrew Bible who is explicitly called little. In Hebrew, she's a na'ara katona, explicitly called little, who speaks. Only little girl in the entire Hebrew Bible who speaks. And what does she say? It's 6 words in Hebrew. In English, oh, that my Lord were in the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. We don't know anything about her backstory. All we know is that she was captured from Israel, and that when she was captured, she was old enough that she would have a memory of this prophet, the prophet Elisha, who's in Samaria, which was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, and she would think to speak this word of kindness. She is set up as the perfect contrast to Naaman. Naaman is the great named Syrian commander who rules. She is the anonymous, young, powerless female Israelite slave who serves. Total contrast, but they come together in this story. She speaks these words, and the story goes on to talk about how he goes to the king and gets a letter so he can go to see the prophet Elisha. He brings all this money to pay, all these gifts to pay Elisha, because prophets got paid for their services. And he gets to Elisha's door, and Elisha sends this messenger who tells him to go dip in the Jordan 7 times. And he gets all outraged. He says, aren't the waters of Abana and Parfar, the waters of Syria, Damascus, aren't they greater than this stupid Jordan River? Jordan's not that impressive. He's onto something there. But then the servants say, why don't you just give it a try, paraphrasing. And he does. And then he dips himself in the Jordan 7 times, and his flesh is made clean. He's made clean. So I suggest to you that her role in this story is somewhat like, so here's the story that I just summarized for you. Look at the verse 14. So he goes on, and he gets cured. And all of these powerful people have gotten involved, like the kings of 2 nations and this prophet Elisha. No one bothers to thank this girl. She is the one who knew about the prophet. She is the one who started this whole miraculous process. But those whom the characters forget, the narrator remembers. Because here in verse 14, his flesh was restored like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean. The Hebrew here is na'ar katon. She was introduced as a na'ara katona, same word in the feminine form. And he has become like her, not only in flesh, but also knowing about this prophet who is in Samaria. So her role, I suggest to you, is like John the Baptist, because she leads others to a miracle worker who cures leprosy, right? John the Baptist leads people to Jesus who cures leprosy. They both refer people to a prophet who works like a shaman, who can harness and direct otherworldly power. Both Elisha and Jesus are wonder-working prophets. They both multiply food, right? You know the story about the loaves and fishes in all the Gospels, but in John's Gospel, it specifically involves a child. But did you know that the prophet Elisha also multiplies food? I'll just read a brief passage for you. This is 2 Kings 4:42. A man came from Baal Shashisha, bringing food from the first fruits to the man of God, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. Elisha said, "Give it to the people and let them eat." But his servant said, "How can I set this before 100 people?" But he repeated, "Give it to the people and let them eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left." He set it before them, they ate and had some left, according to the word of the Lord. Did you know that Elisha does this way before Jesus? They both raise a child from the dead. Jesus raises the son of the widow of Nain, and Elisha raises the son of the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings chapter 4. So there are all of these parallels. The name Elisha and Jesus both come from the same Hebrew word, yasha. Yasha means to save. Jesus, in Aramaic context, means he saves. And Elisha, El, is God. God saves. So I suggest to you that the Israelite slave girl has these parallels. She's not a prophet herself, but she's like John the Baptist in having this role of leading people to prophets, a somewhat prophetic role. Let us take a look at our final prophetic child, and that is the slave girl in Acts. So if this is not at the beginning, we won't be able, because this clip is an hour and 45 minutes in, so let's see. It all worked fine. Let's see if I can get forward it. Okay. No, I'm sorry about that. Okay, that's all right. That's okay. We have the text. So it may be just as well with this one because this one they really take the girl and they make her look like she's totally crazed, and none of that is in the text. So it really brings you so far away from the Bible. But let's take a look. I'll read this for you. This is Acts 16:16. One day, as we were going to the place of prayer, we met a slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners a great deal of money by fortune-telling. While she followed Paul and us, she would cry, "These men are slaves of the Most High God, who proclaim to you a way of salvation." She kept doing this for many days, but Paul, very much annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I order you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out that very hour. This girl points to the realities of slaves. Slaves were very common throughout the ancient world, but especially in the Roman Empire. There are estimates that maybe 1 in 5, or perhaps as many as 1 in 3 people were enslaved. The average Roman household would have 1 or 2 slaves, and this was not only common, it was kind of standard. If you were richer, you'd have far more. You might even have slaves who would accompany you if you left home, but most people had a slave or two. If you were a free person, most free people did. With girls especially, it's important for us to keep in mind that the distinction between slave and prostitute is a false dichotomy. If someone owns your body, they can use it however they like, including selling it for sex or selling it for sex. And so slave girls were extremely vulnerable. But nonetheless, here we see a slave girl who has prophetic gifts. And children can also be gifted. We see that she must have really had some powers because her owners are profiting from her. So she must have been doing something that people felt was worth paying for. The description of her is as a paideia. Paidiske is the feminine diminutive of a girl, especially a female slave or servant. And here when we see she has a spirit of divination, in verse 16, she has a spirit of divination. The Greek here is pneuma puthona, literally the spirit of a python. And Katie Valentine, a New Testament scholar, says this may refer to the python serpent killed by Apollo at Delphi, or be a general term for a spirit or a divination. So here we see this child who has these spiritual gifts. And look at her words here. These men are slaves of the Son Most High. The word here for slave, douloi in Greek, she is putting them on her own level, right? She's a slave and they are slaves. And some manuscripts say she is proclaiming to you a way of salvation. See that little note there? She is proclaiming to you. So the you, human in Greek, some manuscripts say Haman, to us. It's just one letter difference. And so some manuscripts say she is showing to us, the King James Version translates that. The same followed Paul and us and cried, saying, "These men are servants of the Most High God, which show to us the way of salvation." And with this reading of those manuscripts, this girl dares to claim Paul's message of salvation for herself as a slave. She calls them also slaves, and perhaps this is evidence of her further prophetic ability, because she is speaking a word of liberation and justice for all people. And you may be thinking echoes of one of the most famous prophets of our own age, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who also spoke on behalf of slaves and those who are descended from them. There are lots of prophets in the Bible and all around us, and we need to notice our own spiritual gifts. I know for a fact that there are people in this room who have great spiritual gifts, and I urge you, my friends, to listen to your own inner voice and to see how God might be speaking to you and how God may be working with you and through you. You are preachers, you are teachers, you have great mystical connections with God. Be aware of that and know that God calls all kinds of people in all kinds of ways, not just the writing prophets whom we see in the Bible. Childish biblical interpretation here helps us to discover children as integral to the Bible's manifestations and realizations of faith and hope. Both Moses and Jesus, the deliverers of their people, are first introduced to us as children. Samuel answers God's call in the night and brings to light the deceit of Eli's sons, who are abusing their role in the temple of Shiloh. Jeremiah feels reluctant to take on the prophetic role because of his youth, but God assures him of his capability and leads him to speak to nations, which he does. The Israelite slave girl offers a word of hope to a powerful commander and points a man suffering from leprosy to a wonder-working prophet. The prophetic slave girl has proven spiritual gifts and speaks a word of truth and liberation, as prophets do. Children in the Bible, like children around us, can and sometimes do the hard things that they are called to do. Children in the Bible, like children around us, can and sometimes do have prophetic gifts. Children in the Bible, like the children around us, can and sometimes must be courageous. Children in the Bible are used by God to do God's work in the world. The children in the Bible are rarely front and center, but they call to us from the margins to notice and appreciate their stories. The Bible is clear that God needs and uses children and endows them with prophetic gifts. Children in the Bible are not only integral, but they are essential participants in the unfolding of the history of salvation. Thank you, my friends.